Before we begin, drop a comment right now and tell me where you're watching from. California? Texas? Maybe somewhere in the Midwest where nights get just as quiet as they did in Loveland, Colorado? I want to know who's out there, because this story, this case, needs people paying attention. It needed them 27 years ago. It still needs them now. So wherever you are, let me know. And settle in. Because what I'm about to tell you is going to make you question everything you thought you knew about how missing persons cases are handled in this country. Daniel Price stepped out of his apartment and froze. The officer standing on his doorstep had just told him his sister Amber had been located after 27 years, but refused to say where. Refused to say in what condition. Daniel's hands shook so violently he had to grip the railing just to stay upright. His voice cracked as he whispered, "Just tell me if she's alive." The officer lowered his eyes and said nothing. That reaction, the trembling, the fear, the desperate hope wrestling with decades of grief, didn't come out of nowhere. It was shaped by a single night that Loveland, Colorado has never fully recovered from. November 3rd, 1997 started like any other Monday. Kids coasted along sidewalks near Lake Loveland on bikes and skateboards. Families settled in after work. Christmas decorations were already creeping up along Eisenhower Boulevard. The sun dipped early, the way it does in Colorado when autumn starts letting go. People trusted the quiet of that hour. 16-year-old Amber Price finished her shift at the small gift shop near the water at exactly 5:42 p.m. She clocked out, pulled on her jacket, slipped her worn sketchbook into her backpack, and stepped into the back alley behind the store. From there, it was a short walk, through the narrow cut between the auto shop and a fence lined with trash bins, then a quick turn toward Monroe Avenue. 5 minutes. Maybe less. A walk she had taken countless times. She never made it past the alley. Her backpack appeared the next morning. A sanitation worker found it sitting upright behind the dumpsters near the auto shop. Not thrown. Not dropped. Placed, almost carefully. The zipper was open. Her school books were dry. Her wallet was untouched. Cash still inside. Nothing was taken. But everything was wrong. The worker later told police the scene made the hair on his neck stand up. No ripped straps. No signs of a struggle. No dirt smeared across the fabric. Just the quiet, deliberate suggestion that someone wanted that bag found. Officers pulled surveillance footage from a gas station on the corner. The tape was grainy, washed out in places, but one detail stood out clearly. A light-colored Jeep Cherokee rolled out of that alley just minutes after Amber left work. And hanging from its rearview mirror was a strip of dark green cloth. The same shade used in Colorado State Parks uniforms during the 90s. Investigators noted the detail. And then, inexplicably, they didn't push it. Here's the thing that keeps me up at night about this case. That alley behind the gift shop? It was the only spot on the entire block without a working camera. One angle missing. One blind pocket between two buildings. Less than 2 minutes where Amber's footsteps disappeared into silence. Those 2 minutes shaped the next 27 years of her family's life. But for Daniel, it wasn't just the mystery. It was the guilt. The last conversation he had with his sister before she vanished was an argument. A stupid, sibling argument he can't even fully remember anymore. He believed she walked home that night distracted. Upset. Alone. And he believed, for decades, that he carried part of the blame. What he didn't know back then was how much worse the truth would eventually get. "All right, I need you to do something for me right now." If you believe Amber's story deserves to be told, if you're tired of cases like this slipping through the cracks because nobody paid attention, I need you to hit that subscribe button. We're building something here. A community of people who refuse to let these stories die in silence. And right now, we're pushing toward 1,000 subscribers. That's the goal. That's the threshold where this channel can actually start making a difference. Every subscription is a stand. A vote against the people who thought they could make a 16-year-old girl disappear without consequence. A vote against the silence that protected whoever did this for nearly 3 decades. So if you're with me, if you're with Amber, hit subscribe. And let's keep going. On the second day of the search, a patrol officer walked into the Price family home and said something to Amber's mother that would derail the entire investigation before it even had a chance. He said, "We think she ran away." Linda Price stared at him for a full 5 seconds. Then, quietly, with a calm that masked something close to rage, she asked, "Did you even look at her backpack?" The case was already slipping. Search teams spread across Loveland that first week. They covered alleys, drainage canals, the narrow trails leading toward Lake Loveland. Volunteers formed shoulder-to-shoulder lines, moving through open fields near Cattail Creek. They called her name until their voices cracked. When nothing turned up by nightfall, people assumed she had been taken somewhere farther than anyone wanted to say out loud. But inside the Price household, Linda fought the runaway theory with everything she had. She stood in front of their apartment complex, holding the very backpack officers had dismissed. "Her wallet is in here," she said to anyone who would listen. "Her ID is in here. No girl leaves everything she owns behind unless someone forced her." But the runaway label stuck, just long enough to drain the urgency from those critical first hours. The hours that matter most. The hours where trails go cold and witnesses forget. Daniel refused to accept it. He combed the streets until sunrise. Searched every alley between the gift shop and Monroe Avenue. Stopped strangers. Revisited old friends. Retraced Amber's route so many times he could feel every crack in the sidewalk beneath his shoes. At one point, he stood at the mouth of the alley behind the auto shop, the same alley where his sister was last seen, and felt something tighten in his chest. He couldn't explain it. But he knew. The answer lived somewhere inside that 2-minute walk. On the third day, investigators finally interviewed workers from the auto shop. Most knew nothing. But one man, a mechanic who had been working late that night, admitted he heard a vehicle pulling out of the alley around the time Amber left work. "Did you look out the window?" the detective asked. The man shrugged. Figured it was someone grabbing dinner. That careless sentence stayed with Daniel for years. Then came a discovery that should have cracked the case wide open. A volunteer searching the grass behind the gas station found a thin strip of dark green cloth caught on a low branch, fluttering in the wind. The color matched exactly what was seen hanging from the rearview mirror of the Jeep in the surveillance footage. Officers bagged it, logged it, filed it, and moved on. The community started whispering. Some pointed toward an older teen who had moved out of state suddenly right after Amber disappeared. Others mentioned a former teacher who resigned the year before with no explanation. None of it led anywhere. Tension inside the Price household rose with every passing day. Daniel blamed himself openly. Linda tried to calm him but carried her own guilt, replaying a conversation from that morning over and over. A conversation she regretted the moment Amber stepped out the door. Looking back, she said the air in the house had felt heavy that morning. Like the day already knew something she didn't. By the end of the first week, the investigation felt stuck. Officers continued knocking on doors along Monroe Avenue. A few residents reported seeing a light-colored SUV in the area more than once. One neighbor claimed the driver had lingered at the corner the week before. "Can you describe him?" the officer asked. The woman paused, then said he wasn't watching the street. He was watching the kids. Even that wasn't enough to tighten the search. On the 7th day, a detective told Linda they were running out of leads. She didn't respond. She walked to her bedroom, closed the door, and sat on Amber's bed, surrounded by drawings her daughter had left behind. Linda held the sketchbook, flipping slowly through pages filled with small-town scenes, quiet corners, faces drawn from memory. Amber had a gift. An eye for detail most people missed. Near the back, Linda found one drawing she didn't recognize. A girl standing near a fence. A tall shape looming behind her. The figure had no face. She showed it to investigators the next morning. They set it aside with the same dismissive shrug they gave the cloth. The search faded. Volunteers returned to their jobs. News vans stopped coming. Kids went back to school. The streets carried on. But Daniel felt the investigation dying, drifting into a silence that would stretch nearly a decade. And deep down, he sensed that every moment lost was pushing Amber farther from anything they could ever reach. Just when the case seemed to flatline completely, a discovery 10 years later would drag the entire town back into the nightmare and force investigators to ask whether they'd missed the truth right from the very beginning. 10 years after Amber vanished, a contractor pulled a section of drywall from a small rental house in Fort Collins and stumbled backward so fast he slammed into the opposite wall. Behind the false panel was a crawlspace no one knew existed. Inside it sat 3 items: a cracked Polaroid camera, a strand of hair sealed with tape, and a torn piece of notebook paper with one name written across it in heavy, deliberate strokes. Amber Price. It was the first real movement in the case since the week she disappeared. The house sat on the edge of Fort Collins, tucked behind a long gravel driveway and a row of cottonwoods that kept it hidden from the road. It had been empty for months. The contractor was clearing it for remodel when he noticed a narrow seam in the wall where the paint didn't quite match. When he pried it open, the air that rushed out felt stale, trapped for years. Detectives arrived within the hour. They pulled each item out carefully. Fresh gloves. Evidence bags. Complete silence. The Polaroid camera was the type people carried before digital took over. The strand of hair had been taped to a small plastic sleeve, preserved intentionally, like it was meant to be kept. But the torn paper drew the most attention. Amber's name was pressed so hard into the page that it left indentations on the other side. Someone wanted that name found. News spread through Loveland like wildfire. Residents who barely remembered the original case in 1997 suddenly felt the old fear return. People talked about the crawl space like something dark had been hiding right under the state's nose for a decade. Linda was called first. When the detective told her they may have found new evidence connected to her daughter, her voice barely came out. "Is she there?" she asked. The answer was no. No remains. No clothing. No sign that Amber had ever physically been inside that crawl space. Just those 3 objects. Daniel drove to Loveland that night. He sat in the parking lot of the police station, hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel, staring at the building where his sister's case file had gathered dust for a decade. He thought the discovery would bring relief. Instead, it felt like being dragged closer to a truth he wasn't sure he could survive. Investigators ran DNA on the strand of hair. Weeks passed with no updates. When the results finally came back, everyone expected a match to Amber or to someone clearly connected to her. Instead, the test pointed to a man from Cheyenne, Wyoming. A man who had died 2 years earlier. No criminal record. No clear connection to the Price family. No obvious reason his DNA would be sealed inside a hidden crawl space alongside Amber's name. The discovery that was supposed to answer questions only opened new ones. Officers scrambled to connect the Cheyenne man to the Fort Collins property. No lease records. No work history in the area. The property owner didn't recognize him. Neighbors couldn't recall anyone matching his description. Every thread led to a dead end. The torn paper was equally confusing. Forensic testing couldn't determine when the name was written. The ink was common. The paper was the kind sold at any office supply store. Someone wanted Amber's name in that crawl space, but nobody could say if it was placed there in 1997, 2001, or just before the discovery in 2007. The camera held the most hope. Investigators prayed the film inside would develop into something usable. When the photos came back completely blank, the disappointment was crushing. The press called it a cruel false start. For the Price family, it felt far worse. They had spent 10 years waiting in the quiet, hoping for anything. When the crawl space appeared, they thought they were finally standing at the edge of an answer. Instead, they were staring at a dead man from Wyoming and a collection of objects that connected to nothing. Daniel barely slept in the weeks that followed. He told a friend the entire discovery felt staged, like someone wanted investigators chasing the wrong leads. It wasn't just the paper. It was the hair that didn't match Amber. The camera placed beside it. The clean floor. Nothing scattered. Nothing accidental. Every piece looked arranged. After months of trying to force meaning from those 3 objects, the case stalled again. The Fort Collins house was torn down a year later. The debris cleared. The land sold. The crawl space became a memory, then a cautionary tale about false hope in cold cases. Loveland returned to its rhythm. New families filled old homes. Time moved forward. But for the Price family, the discovery left a different mark. It proved that someone was still moving pieces long after Amber vanished. Someone out there was watching, waiting, and playing a game investigators hadn't even begun to understand. What no one realized then was that the crawl space wasn't a dead end. It was a warning. The real answer was still hidden miles from Loveland, waiting inside a metal box that wouldn't surface for another 17 years. Let me ask you something. How many of you watching right now have ever felt like a case you followed just stopped being covered? Like the story disappeared and nobody seemed to care anymore? That's what happened to Amber Price. For 17 years after that crawl space, her name faded into cold case obscurity. Another folder in a cabinet. Another family left waiting. But here's the thing, we don't have to let that happen anymore. If you want cases like this to stay visible, share this video. Send it to someone who needs to hear it. Post it on your socials. Every share pushes this story into feeds where it can actually make a difference. And drop a comment, tell me what you think so far. Do you believe someone was deliberately leading investigators in the wrong direction? Because I've got my theory, and I want to hear yours. When you comment, when you share, you're not just engaging with a video. You're standing on the opposite side of whoever thought they could bury this story. You're making noise when they wanted silence. So make some noise. Let's keep going. In April 2024, a park ranger hiking a rocky trail near Horsetooth Reservoir stopped mid-step. Something metallic was wedged between 2 stones, half buried in dirt and debris. A rusted box wrapped in faded green cloth. He knelt, brushed away the grime, pried it open. And when he saw the student ID inside, he whispered a name that had been sitting on Colorado's missing persons list for 27 years. Amber Price. The case came roaring back from the dead. The ranger called it in before finishing his shift. Officers arrived within the hour. They documented the box, the surrounding terrain, every angle that might explain how it got there. The cloth wrapping caught their attention first. Faded and torn, but unmistakable, the same dark green shade seen hanging from the rearview mirror of the Jeep Cherokee on the 1997 surveillance tape. That single detail sent shockwaves through everyone who remembered the original case. Inside the box were 3 items: Amber's original student ID from 1997, her photo still visible beneath a layer of grime, a disposable camera wrapped in a small piece of the same green fabric, a torn sheet of notebook paper, ripped along the left edge when forensic analysts compared that torn edge to the paper found in the Fort Collins crawlspace 17 years earlier. The shape matched perfectly. 2 halves. 2 locations. 17 years apart. Someone had been carrying both pieces all along. Detectives Rowan Pierce and Mia Lawson from the Colorado Cold Case Unit took over the investigation. They were known for dismantling old files and rebuilding timelines with modern forensic tools. But when they examined the metal box, they knew immediately this wasn't random. Someone had chosen that rocky ledge. Someone wanted this found. The question was, why now? The camera was transported to the lab with extreme care. Technicians managed to extract several frames from the degraded film. Most were too dark or blurred to use. But one image changed everything. A woman, standing near a metal door. Head turned slightly away from the lens. A faint bruise along her jawline. Hair longer than Amber's had been in 1997. The timestamp read 2001. She was alive for years after she vanished. For the Price family, that photograph didn't bring relief. It brought questions too raw to process. Where was she kept? Who controlled her movements? Why hadn't she escaped? And the question that cut deepest, why didn't anyone know? Pierce and Lawson went back to the original evidence logs from the 90s. What they found confirmed every suspicion the family had carried for decades. Mislabeled items. Lost notes. Early assumptions that had poisoned the entire investigation from day one. The green cloth found behind the gas station in 1997? Tossed into a box marked miscellaneous debris. The Jeep sighting? Logged without a single follow-up. The runaway classification? It had slowed everything down within the first 48 hours, the most critical window in any missing persons case. But one file made Lawson stop cold. A handwritten note from a junior detective in 1997 that read, possible link between cloth color and state parks uniforms. Needs follow-up. It never received one. The new team dug deeper. They used DMV archives to trace every light-colored Jeep Cherokee registered in northern Colorado during the late 90s. One name surfaced. Mark Hansen. Fort Collins resident. Seasonal maintenance worker. Frequent assignments near state parks and rural service roads. Owner of a Jeep that matched the shape in the 1997 surveillance footage. But Hansen had died in 2017. His property had been auctioned. His Jeep scrapped. Everything physical connected to him was gone. Still, the deeper Lawson looked, the more one detail kept appearing. Hansen's employment records listed a subcontractor who worked irregular hours, signed paperwork in shaky handwriting, and had no complete personnel file. A man who appeared and disappeared on schedules that made no sense. His name appeared only one way across every document, R. Callahan. Pierce requested background checks immediately. Nothing came back. No address. No driver's license. No tax records. No social security trail. It was a ghost identity, but one that had been used convincingly enough to pass through official paperwork for years. Weeks later, a birth certificate finally surfaced from Wyoming. The handwriting matched the shaky signature on a P.O. Box application filed in Loveland in 1997. The same year Amber disappeared. The certificate belonged to a boy who had entered foster care in the 1970s and vanished from the system at age 7. Someone had stolen that identity, carried it into adulthood, and used it to hide in plain sight for decades. The 2001 photograph became the anchor of the new investigation. Lawson studied every detail. The metal door behind the woman, the grooves, the hinge placement, the frame. She compared it against old storage unit catalogs from manufacturers who sold in Colorado during the early 2000s. Only 3 areas used that exact model between 2000 and 2002: Longmont, Cheyenne, and a site just north of Fort Collins. The Fort Collins site had burned down in 2009. Records lost. Units destroyed. But one detail survived through a supplier invoice. A unit there had been rented under a fake name connected to the same P.O. box opened in Loveland in 1997. Pierce and Lawson drove to the charred remains. Only concrete pads were left. Weeds pushing through cracks. Standing there, Pierce said something that would echo through the investigation and through the comment section when viewers finally heard it. Someone built a world where she couldn't be found. Daniel was contacted shortly after. Detectives showed him the 2001 photograph. He stared at it without blinking. His breath caught. And then, quietly, almost to himself, he said, "That's her jawline. That's her fear." The price of hope hit him all at once. He had spent half his life grieving, mourning, trying to move forward while dragging 27 years of guilt behind him. Now he had to face the possibility that his sister had been alive for years after she vanished, trapped in rooms specifically designed to erase her from the world. As the investigation pressed forward, every thread pointed to one person. Not Hansen, but the man who moved through job sites under forged signatures and borrowed uniforms. The man who learned early how to disappear. The man who returned keys to a storage unit on July 18, 2001. Ard Callahan. His name was the first true lead in decades. But it wasn't the last. Because the evidence found next would suggest something even more disturbing. He wasn't working alone. When detectives unlocked the Longmont storage unit linked to Callahan, Daniel stepped inside first. He expected darkness. Instead, he saw sketches scattered across the cold concrete floor, charcoal drawings of a woman older than Amber had been in 1997. The strokes were hurried, frantic. Some pages were torn. Others smudged beyond recognition. But the last sketch was different. It showed a long road stretching toward a distant horizon. No buildings. No figures. Just open asphalt disappearing into nothing. She had been dreaming of escape. The truth wasn't hiding anymore. Detectives Pierce and Lawson used a rusted key recovered from the ranger station workshop to open the inactive unit. The door stuck at first, grinding against the track before rolling upward with a metallic shriek that echoed down the empty rows. Dust swirled in the light. At first glance, it looked like any forgotten storage space. Abandoned. Decaying. But the silence inside carried something heavier than neglect. A folding chair lay overturned in the corner. Beside it sat the stack of sketches, each drawn in the same quick, confident strokes Amber had used as a teenager. The faces were thinner now. older. But the eyes were unmistakable. She had been here long enough to sketch, erase, and sketch again. Charcoal stains marked the concrete in spots, outlines of pages ripped away in frustration or desperation. Chains hung from a wall stud. Clean metal against weathered wood. The floor beneath them showed worn circles, the kind made when someone tries to stand, sit, and shift position in the same small space over and over again. Pierce crouched, ran his fingers along one of the grooves. She paced here, he said quietly. Daniel couldn't speak. He kept returning to the final sketch, the one showing the long empty road. No landmarks. No people. Just the desperate image of freedom drawn by someone who hadn't seen it in years. Lawson checked the insulation along the back wall. Something small was tucked behind it. A receipt. Modern. Dated just for months earlier. A routine gas purchase in Fort Collins, paid with a card under the name R. Callahan. The room went cold. Either Callahan was still alive, or someone else had taken control of his identity the same way he once controlled Amber. The timeline was becoming terrifying. If Amber was alive in 2001, and the metal box at Horsetooth was placed in 2024, then someone had stayed connected to this case across decades. This wasn't a crime that ended with an abduction. It was a chain of control that stretched across 27 years. Pierce and Lawson returned to the ranger station workshop, the location where the rusted key had been discovered. The hidden room inside matched the 2001 photograph down to the exact bracket placement on the wall. Lawson swept her flashlight across the ceiling and noticed something she'd missed before. Faint scratches above the door frame. 3 letters, barely visible. AMP Amber Price. She had tried to leave a message. Pierce followed the discovery with another. Hansen's old work logs, previously dismissed as irrelevant, contained a final subcontractor notation: Callahan returned keys to Fort Collins storage, the 18th of July, 01. But handwritten beneath it, almost as an afterthought, was a second line: partner present. No name. No signature. Someone else had been there. Daniel stayed silent as investigators processed the unit. He held the sketch of the long road one last time before placing it carefully into an evidence sleeve. Not because it belonged to him, but because it was the closest thing he had to hearing his sister's voice after 27 years of silence. Near the end of the sweep, Lawson found one final piece of evidence. A small note taped beneath the overturned chair. Pencil on thin paper. Faded from years of exposure. Most of it was illegible. But one sentence was clear: I tried to come home, he found me first. When Daniel read those words, his hands shook the same way they had the night the officer told him Amber had been located. But this time, he didn't freeze. He stepped back into the doorway, stared out at the empty concrete lot beyond the storage rows, and said one quiet sentence that carried every ounce of 27 years of pain, guilt, and desperate hope: I'm not stopping now. Because the truth wasn't finished. And the person using the Callahan name wasn't done moving. And that's where this case stands right now. Open. Active. Still unfolding. Amber Price spent 27 years in silence, trapped in systems that failed her, hidden by someone who thought they could erase her from existence. But here's the thing about silence. It only works when nobody's listening. And right now, you're listening. You're here. And that means something. If this story moved you, if you believe Amber deserves answers, and her family deserves the truth, then I need you to do 3 things before you click away. First, hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. We're building toward 1,000 subscribers, and every single one of you gets us closer to keeping cases like this visible. This isn't about algorithm numbers, it's about building a community that refuses to let these stories disappear. Second, like this video. It sounds small, but it tells the platform this story matters. And when enough people say it matters, it reaches more feeds. More eyes. More people who might know something. Third, share this video with someone who needs to see it. Post it. Text it. Send the link. You never know who's out there with a missing piece of this puzzle. And finally, comment. Tell me your theory. Tell me what you think happened in that 2-minute window. Tell me if you believe Callahan is still out there, or if someone else has been pulling the strings all along. Every like, every share, every comment, every subscription, it's a stand. It's a choice. It's you saying, I'm on the side of the truth. Because the people who did this? They're counting on silence. They're counting on nobody caring. Let's prove them wrong. I'm Crimes After Midnight, and I'll see you in the next one. Subscribe for more cold case deep dives. Next video drops tomorrow. The silence ends here.